The winds blowing across North America are now shifting southward, while tensions are rising between the two countries, long known as neighbors and trade partners. Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum's message, "We will resist until the end," has created a bombshell effect in the lobbies. But which parts of the U.S. economy could Mexico really paralyze? Which measures will be the most difficult for the U.S. in critical sectors such as automotive, agriculture, and oil?
Where U.S. President Donald Trump has signed tariffs on imports from Canada, Mexico, and China.
We start in the U.S., where President Donald Trump is sending 1,500 troops to the Mexican border to boost security.
We understand vast amounts of fentanyl have poured into our country from Mexico. And as you know, also
U.S. President Donald Trump is delaying tariffs on imports from Mexico for a month. Its President Claudia Sheinbaum says. She spoke to Trump on the phone earlier today.
Until it shows that the diplomatic tension that has been rising rapidly in the recent period has almost reached the dimension of an economic Cold War. So much so that the decisions on the agenda in Mexico have made the Washington administration very uneasy. In particular, the harsh steps taken by Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum against the U.S. administration, which continues the Donald Trump line, are fueling the concern of, is a major crisis emerging on the southern border? Sheinbaum's recent statements show that the independent policies that have long been talked about in Mexico City are now in the flesh. But is Mexico really preparing for a tit-for-tat with the U.S.? This is not yet a trade war, but both Mexico's radical decisions and the reactions from Washington suggest that this tension should not be underestimated. Some official sources have announced that the Mexican government has decided to impose heavy tariffs on some U.S. imports.
Ha prevalecido el diálogo y sobre todo el respeto entre nuestras naciones.
Not only did the Sheinbaum government clearly emphasize that we will not submit to any imposition that threatens Mexico's sovereign rights. This move almost came as a shock in the United States. Some political circles in Washington even began to whisper that Mexico is seeking a new Latin American leadership. Diplomats are arguing that the Trump administration is making relations with Mexico more difficult by recalling its long-standing protectionist policies. At this point, the idea that Claudia Sheinbaum could be a thorn in Trump's side is a phrase frequently used by local and foreign media in recent days.
México no solo no quiere que el fentanilo llegue a Estados Unidos, sino que no queremos que llegue a ninguna parte.
This is because Sheinbaum has repeatedly stated in her recent press statements that as long as the U.S. does not change its view of Latin America, we will not hesitate to harden our policies. Sheinbaum's firm stance and strong leadership implies that Mexico can deal with any of Trump's policies. The day is coming when the Latin world will show its strength against the imposing style shaped by the Donald Trump school, he told a press conference at the Mexican National Palace. This was perceived by pro-Trump politicians in the U.S. as hostile rhetoric. Indeed, it is possible to argue that this tension has turned from a mere trade dispute into a political showdown. Sheinbaum has been able to build public support on Mexico's independent stance, while Trump supporters are calling for much tougher measures against the threat from the southern border. On the other hand, the real problem is based on migration and cartels, which have not been resolved for years. Mexico exports around 80% of its goods to the United States, and last year trade between the two countries exceeded $800 billion. But no matter how strong trade relations are, deep disagreements over security and migration policies continue to pit the two sides against each other. Sheinbaum calls White House claims that Mexican smugglers have an intolerable relationship with the Mexican government offensive, defamatory and baseless. Trump has made it clear that he is targeting Mexico to force it to stop the flow of migrants and drug trafficking into the U.S. The U.S. accuses Mexico of turning a blind eye to security weaknesses, while Mexico argues that the problem cannot be solved unless the U.S. reins in its own consumption demand. While the parties have been unable to agree on this issue for a long time, it now seems to have sparked a bigger crisis. One of Sheinbaum's draconian decisions is to suspend economic cooperation agreements along the country's northern border. Due to unilateral pressures, we are freezing various cooperation projects that we have carried out with the United States in the border regions in recent years. the Mexican Ministry of Economy announced at a meeting. In other words, Mexico aims to rebalance the economy by limiting the duty-free crossing of U.S. companies across the border. This step has caused particular concern among the business community in the states of Texas and Arizona. So what tariffs could Mexico impose against the U.S.? How dependent is the U.S. on Mexico? And what are Sheinbaum's trump cards in this tension? The sheer volume of trade between the two countries stands out. The U.S. is an economy that prefers to buy Mexican products without interruption, especially in the automotive sector. Mexico's share is enormous. Many American brands have parts manufactured in Mexico or set up complementary production lines along the southern border. If Sheinbaum's government imposes additional taxes on these parts and slows down the supply chain, the entire automotive market from Detroit to Los Angeles could be deeply shaken. Many factories in the U.S. depend on components from Mexico. Interrupting this dependence would impose heavy costs on American automotive giants. On the agricultural front, the picture is even more interesting. Mexico sells huge quantities of fruits, vegetables, and meat products to the U.S. market. From California to Texas, restaurants, grocery chains, and even major food companies rely on Mexican products. If Mexico decides to impose export restrictions or tariffs on agricultural products, prices in the U.S. could skyrocket. More striking is the potential for Mexico to hit U.S. agriculture with regulations on migrant workers. This is because many seasonal workers work in American fields. Depending on this flow between the two countries, if the Sheinbaum government says, we are moving to a different practice at the border crossings, the U.S. agricultural sector could face a noticeable labor shortage. Oil and energy is a different equation. Mexico has long been known for its policy of nationalizing its resources. U.S. refineries are partly dependent on heavy crude oil, especially from Mexico. If the Sheinbaum administration sharply slows this flow or reduces exports under the guise of prioritizing domestic consumption, the U.S. energy market could face a supply shortage. Despite not being a member of OPEC, there is talk that Mexico will pursue price-raising policies to protect its interests. This, in turn, could push up gasoline costs in the U.S. and turn voters' anger against the Trump administration. Another powerful leverage: Mexico has its geographical proximity and the reality of its huge land border. America's thousands of kilometers of border is loaded with millions of dollars of goods every day. Suddenly tightening the screws on this trade and introducing fine-grained controls at customs gates could bring U.S. logistics companies and the retail sector to its knees. The image of trucks waiting for hours at the border and supermarkets with empty shelves would be a nightmare for the Trump team. Until now, Mexico is restrained from overplaying this trump card, but Sheinbaum left open the possibility of a serious slowdown at the gates, saying, "We will not bow down anymore." Another aspect of U.S. dependence on Mexico lies in its migration and security policies. For years, Washington has used Mexico as a buffer zone to stem the flow of migrants. The Mexican state stops or registers Central American or South American refugees at the border before they reach the north. If Sheinbaum says we will no longer take on this responsibility, tens of thousands of migrants could arrive at the U.S. border. That would be a humanitarian and political crisis, even if Trump supporters revive the wall slogan. In practice, it would be a huge wave of migration. That would put the administration in a difficult position. The clues to the question: how can the U.S. paralyze the automotive, agriculture, and oil industries can be read precisely through these dependencies. The supply chain in automotive, crops and labor in agriculture, crude oil and refinery compatibility in energy. U.S. companies have long invested in Mexico due to its cost advantage and logistical convenience. The most critical aspect of this dependence is that it is very difficult to establish alternative production or supply lines in a short period of time. Sheinbaum sees precisely this gap. The Americans will have to spend years shifting elsewhere, and until then we will drive a hard bargain with them. Among Mexico's trump cards are the trade privileges that NAFTA, or ASUNGA as it is now called, brings with it. This agreement, although revised in favor of the United States, gives Mexico the right to export large quantities of tariff-free goods. Sheinbaum could back the U.S. into a corner by threatening to bend or violate the terms of this agreement, a message that we will enforce. The requirement of a certain percentage of domestic production, and American producers will pay the price, would set alarm bells ringing in Washington. After all, Trump supporters are already questioning free trade agreements. But if Mexico completely turns the table, the U.S. business community could literally panic. In addition to all these factors, Sheinbaum's political influence should not be underestimated. Mexico's nationalist and left-leaning base has been uncomfortable with the idea of U.S. domination for years. Sheinbaum seems determined to capitalize on this discontent in foreign policy while at the same time, he says, he will erode American economic influence in the border states. This is a jolt that will be felt in the southern states of the U.S. Regions like Texas and Arizona have an integrated economic circulation. With Mexico, we could block trade and transit points here. Sheinbaum threatens, which could put a lot of pressure on U.S. domestic politics. Sources in Washington argue that Mexico could undermine Trump. With these maneuvers, American businesses in the border regions could pay the price for the protectionism and anti-immigrant policies imposed by the Trump school. This could slow down the economy in the southern states of the U.S. and cause Trump points in the election atmosphere.